Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Pollitt. I'm with NAESP and serve as the Chief Strategist for Policy and Alliances. I'm happy to welcome you to the second presentation on Title I, specifically related to the law's accountability system. This is the next iteration of webinars and our presentations as part of the ESSA Nuts and Bolts presentations, and really this work is designed to help you understand the new provisions in the law, what you need to know, and how the law will help you be successful. Again, I'd like to extend a special welcome to NASP members and others who are joining us today. We've been working over the past 5 years very diligently on Capitol Hill, leading up to the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and we're excited now to be in the midst of sharing with you the new provisions and finally, where the law will better acknowledge and support the role of principals, and especially to build their capacity to be successful. It's great news that we have ESSA. We're now in a new time we'll begin to shift to implementation as states and districts have begun the planning process, and we're certainly on top of trying to help principals understand how they can and must play an important role in that implementation and planning process. We know there are several provisions of the law that are important to principals, namely the accountability and assessment provisions. And today we have two esteemed colleagues and peers that NASP is pleased to work with on a regular basis to discuss in more depth the new accountability system under ESSA, and really describe how we have moved to put an end to the onerous NCLB one-size-fits-all approach to accountability, and discuss how that will be moving ahead and what states and districts may be considering with regard to accountability and really looking at a new picture of school and student performance. NASP pushed to put in place systems that support principals in using a multi-metric accountability system, and one that specifically focuses on student growth. So we're pleased today to talk a little bit more about this and what's been put into place. Amy Starzinski and Reg Leakty are here, as I mentioned, both founding partners of Foresight Law and Policy. They have accomplished careers at the federal level working on education policy. Both have worked at the state level within state government and in education and telecommunications and other related policy, and they're here to share their extraordinary expertise and prowess on both ESSA and also some of a little bit about the proposed rules that are percolating right now. So we'll share that with you. So I'm going to turn it over to Reg and Amy and let them walk through the new accountability provisions.
Thanks so much, Kelly, and thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you about the Every Student Succeeds Act accountability provisions. And if you wouldn't mind transitioning to the first slide.
There we go.
Terrific, thank you. So I'm going to kick off with a quick introduction before handing it off to Amy, and just a reminder that we're now 6 months into this first phase of implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was approved by Congress and signed by the President last December. It's hard to believe we've sprinted ahead 6 months into the process. An incredible amount of work has been undertaken both at the federal level and at the state and no doubt local level over the course of that period. And we've seen the U.S. Department of Education publish a number of Dear Colleagues letters to help provide some additional initial guidance to states about implementation of the law, including sharing some frequently asked questions documents. But most importantly, the department has also led an important early rulemaking process, beginning with a negotiated rulemaking that involved stakeholders from all across the United States for a period of about 4 weeks on the law's assessment and some other provisions. And most importantly for our conversation today, the Department of Education has published a notice of proposed rulemaking specifically focused on ESSA's accountability requirements, on the law's report card requirements. So we're really privileged today to have this opportunity to talk with you about the core elements of the statute, of course, and accountability, but also the provisions of the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking that the public has about 5 weeks left before the initial comment deadline of August 1st. So we're going to spend a little bit of time briefing you on those provisions and also the statutory requirements, and look forward to discussing our presentation with you and questions at the end. This is a reminder that as we talk today about the accountability NPRM, those rules are still in the form of a proposal for public comment. Now, many elements are likely to become regulation with the full force and effect of law, but for now know that what we're presenting today is critically important information, we think, for the implementation work you're doing in the near term, and will have big implications into the fall as states develop more concrete plans for implementing Title I. So please do note that some of this information will be in flux. Much of it, however, will become formal regulation later in the year, leading up to states filing of their Title I or consolidated plans sometime next spring or early summer. Next slide, please.
Reg, this is Kelly. Before you move on, I think it's important to share with our NAESP members on that point. We currently have a survey out to all members collecting comments and input on the proposed rules in certain areas. And you'll have some contact information at the end of this presentation if you'd like to get in touch and have not received that survey, in order for NAESP to provide official written comments to the proposed rules. Thank you.
Terrific. So today we're going to focus on, as I mentioned, the accountability requirements. We're also going to talk briefly about some of the core elements of Title I that are directly related to state and local accountability systems. We're going to talk about assessment briefly, and I know Kelly and team will dive deeper on that issue in future TA for all of you. Of course, focus on the accountability requirements, the differentiation that states and districts have to do on an annual basis, the supports and interventions that are related to that for the lowest performing schools that are identified through that system, and also briefly touching on the report card requirements of Title I. So that is our high-level overview, and I'm going to hand it off now to Amy to take us a little bit deeper into some of the core requirements of the law and the rulemaking.
Thank you, Reg. So let me say at the outset that ESSA and the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking not only give us a whole new set of requirements, but in many ways a whole new language, a new vernacular for talking about these issues of assessment and accountability. So I'll try to highlight some of those new terms as we all get used to trying to understand them and what they mean for state and local systems. One important difference from behind the ESSA is this requirement of long-term goals and measurements of interim progress. So no longer are states and districts and schools required to operate under the annual measurable objective AMO requirements, or AYP, that we had in No Child Left Behind, that had a federally established goal of 100% proficiency by X date. Under ESSA, states are required, for working with districts and schools and other stakeholders, to establish long-term goals, and then based on those goals, measurements of interim progress. Those goals have to be in at least 3 areas: improved academic achievement, improved graduation rate, and increases in English language proficiency. So another major Child Left Behind is that English language proficiency is really moved from a Title III accountability requirement to Title I and incorporated squarely within accountability now from goal setting through supports and interventions. For each of these three areas of goals, the goals have to address, as No Child Left Behind did, the kind of all student group and each subgroup of students. Each goal, including achievement and graduation rate, must use multi-year lengths of time, but it's up to the state to determine what those lengths of time are. And for subgroups, the goals and interim targets must take into account the greater progress that some groups of students need in order to close achievement gaps. And then shifting to the accountability indicators. So there are some key differences here from No Child Left Behind as well. There are really a minimum of 5 areas of indicators or measurement for accountability. 3 of them apply to all schools. So there's academic achievement indicator, which is really student performance on statewide assessments. And for the academic achievement indicator, high schools may also, in addition to calculating proficiency, high schools may add a measure of student growth under that first category of academic achievement. The second category is progress in achieving English language proficiency. So for all schools, that is required to be a measure in the accountability system. The third, and one that I know is of great interest to many of you, is this school quality or student success indicator or indicators. There has to be at least one measure of school quality and student success as part of a statewide system of accountability. But at the state's discretion, they could use multiple of those indicators. For schools with elementary and middle grades, the fourth category is academic progress indicator. And that could be another academic indicator, and I'll talk in just a minute about the criteria for selecting indicators. But that could be another academic indicator or a growth measure, and so not required to be growth for elementary and middle schools, but may be. And then the fifth for schools with high school grades is the graduation rate indicator. Again, that has to be a 4-year cohort grad rate, but at the state's discretion, they could use also an extended cohort graduation rate as part of accountability. ESSA, speaking just in terms of the statute as it was enacted, also addresses test participation. So you'll recall under No Child Left Behind, 95% test participation was treated just like any other indicator in the accountability system. And a school that missed test participation for any subgroup of students missed AYP. Congress was really passionate in their discussion about test participation in light of a lot of the pushback and opt-out movement in a number of states. So ESSA requires test participation be part of a state's accountability system, but leaves it to states to determine how test participation, and in particular the 95% target, will be used and what weight might be assigned to it. As we get later into the slide deck, I'll talk about some of the proposed consequences for failure to meet test participation. So not on the slide, but let me just highlight too, as states look to select the specific measures for each of these indicator areas, the proposed regulations establish some criteria for them that will act to kind of limit states' options. Any indicator, has to be valid, reliable, and comparable across all of the districts within the state. They have to be calculated in the same way for all schools, except there may be variation, particularly around school quality and student success indicators, in how they're calculated for different grade spans. Again, they have to be disaggregated for every subgroup of students. And for the school quality and student success indicator, as well as the academic progress indicator, which may be the growth measure for elementary and middle schools, that measure has to be supported by research that performance or progress on the measure would be likely to increase student achievement, or at the high school level likely to increase graduation rate. So those are a number of the restrictions that states are going to have to, or would have to, should this notice be finalized as it's drafted. And then, unlike AYP, where all of the indicators were weighted equally and essentially a miss on any indicator for any subgroup led to identification, under ESSA, states have a lot more flexibility to design accountability systems. But there are some parameters here. So a state has to use all of its indicators in differentiating the performance of all schools. Again, you have to use all student group data and data for each subgroup. But then two other really important rules. So the academic indicators, which on this slide are those things on the right-hand side of the scale: academic achievement, growth or academic performance for elementary and middle grades, high school graduation rate, and then the measure of English language proficiency. Those indicators individually, if you looked at each one individually, have to have substantial weight. And when they're combined, those four indicators have to have much greater weight than the indicator of school quality or student success. And in designing a system, those substantial weight indicators, those four indicators on the right, don't have to weight equally, right? So a school could have differentiation where elementary grades growth outweighs progress in English language proficiency, so long as each of them individually have substantial weight. So on the topic of growth, because we've got that elementary and middle grades growth option, and the way the weighting rules are structured, I do think it's my read of this that an elementary or middle grades school could assign more weight to growth through that academic, through that growth measure than they do other indicators. For high schools, it's harder to achieve significantly much more weight for growth because it's got to be balanced with the academic achievement indicator. But I do think there's a lot more room for elementary grades and even high school leaders to factor growth into accountability. So what do much greater weight and substantial weight mean? And they're significant because, as you know, they then limit the weight that a state can assign to the measure of school quality and student success. So the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking does not really define much greater weight or substantial weight, but they create some kind of tests, if you will, some ways that states are going to be required to demonstrate that they have assigned much greater weight or substantial weight. And we'll get later on to the identification of schools, but essentially states have to identify at least two groups of schools for support and improvement, comprehensive and targeted. And much greater weight really means that the school quality and student success indicators cannot be used to change the identity of a school that would be identified for comprehensive and support, unless there's evidence that a subgroup performance or the all-student group, based on the substantial weight indicators, have made significant progress. And similarly, once you indicators independently, again, the school quality and student success indicator cannot outweigh the substantial weight indicators. one of the more complicated areas of the law. And then you take that weighting and the measures and indicators that a state has identified, and a state then has great latitude in terms of how to combine them. Each of the indicators have to have at least 3 performance levels assigned to it. So a school would be assigned a performance level for each indicator. Those then have to be combined using that weighting restriction, and a school will be assigned a summative rating from among at least 3 different ratings categories that the state establishes. And then those categories lead to the identification of schools in a number of areas for improvement. Let me touch then on the identification of schools and how these categories are defined in the law and in the notice of proposed rulemaking. So there are really 2 broad categories: comprehensive support and improvement and targeted support and improvement. And if your state has been operating under a waiver from No Child Left Behind, this isn't a dramatic shift, right? Comprehensive is really meant to signal and address issues of performance that are systemic or span multiple subgroups within a school. And targeted support and improvement is really meant to address isolated issues or specific subgroup issues that may not be evidenced in terms of school-wide performance issues. Within comprehensive support and improvement, there are 3 ways a school may be identified, and there are 2 ways a school may be identified for targeted support. So I'm going to talk through each of those now briefly. So a state in identifying targeted support and improvement schools has to identify 2 specific groups: low-performing subgroups. So those are schools in which one or more subgroup is performing at or below the summative level of performance of all students in any school that the state identifies as being among the lowest 5% performing. So to get to this, you first have to identify your comprehensive support to know which are the lowest 5%. But then a state would look at that lowest 5%. Oops, sorry, I had one too fast. Back up. So a state would look at the lowest 5%, and then for every school, if any single subgroup of students is performing at or below that level, they would be identified as a low-performing subgroup. Consistently low-performing requires a state methodology to determine in any school if one or more subgroups of students is consistently low-performing. And that means simply that over not more than 2 years, the subgroup has performance issues that would subject it to identification. And that must use the much greater weight or academic indicators as part of that decision making. A state could identify a school as consistently low performing only on the basis of 95% participation, if it desired. Comprehensive support and improvement, there are 3 ways. So much like priority schools under waiver, a state has to determine the lowest 5% of Title I schools. There's a subgroup that hasn't, that's been identified that hasn't improved over 3 years, then they have to be identified as a chronically low-performing subgroup. Any school that has performance in the lowest 5% of Title I schools has to be identified based on the summative rating and averaged over not more than 3 years. And then in the grad rate category, any high school using the 4-year cohort rate has a graduation rate of 67% or lower. And again, the state can use average data, but for not more than 3 years. I'll talk in just a minute about the timeline for identifying these two groups of schools for improvement. But once they're identified, there are really two sets of requirements. So for targeted support and improvement, and I'll focus here really on the district and school responsibilities. So if it's a subgroup issue that leads to targeted support and improvement identification, the state notifies the district notifies the school, and then the school, working in partnership with stakeholders and others, has to develop and implement an improvement plan that's informed by all of the indicators. It uses a needs assessment to help identify the specific strategies to be used, and includes evidence-based interventions that would address the weaknesses of the school. That plan would have to be approved and monitored by the district, not by the state. In order to exit a targeted support and improvement category, the state will have to determine some exit criteria and timeline. But really, it's the responsibility of the district to make sure that the school has successfully implemented an improvement plan, has improved outcomes for the lowest performing students, and if the accountability system were run again, the school would have to no longer meet the criteria for identification. If, based on the timeline set by the state, a school that's identified for targeted support and improvement fails to exit that category, then the district has to require the school take steps to amend the plan, to review and revise it as necessary, and the state would have to, the district would have to increase its monitoring and support for the implementation of the plan. If the exit criteria isn't satisfied in a timeline established by the state, which may not exceed 3 years, then the school has to be identified for comprehensive support and improvement. For comprehensive support and improvement, regardless of how a school is identified, whether it's for a chronically low-performing subgroup, placement in the lowest 5% of Title I schools, or low graduation rate, the state and district responsibilities are essentially the same. So a district would have to notify parents of the identification, oversee the development and implementation of the school's improvement plan, and as with targeted, that has to be informed by all of the indicators. It has to be based on a school-level needs assessment. But in the case of comprehensive support and improvement schools, that needs assessment also has to focus on the identification of resource inequities and any that may exist that would need to be addressed both by the school and the district. That needs assessment then needs to lead to the identification of evidence-based interventions. And the notice of proposed rulemaking, the proposed requirements talk about the kind of strongest levels of evidence available to support the selection of evidence-based interventions, but I won't go into detail on that now. A comprehensive support and improvement plan developed by the school and district then has to be approved by the district as well as submitted to the state education agency for approval. They're also subject to monitoring by the state in a way that the targeted improvement plans are not. For comprehensive support and improvement, the state also establishes exit criteria as well as the timeline. So for comprehensive support, the timeline set by the state has to require or anticipate exit from that status in not more than 4 years. If a school fails to exit in that timeline, then the state is required to increase its intervention, its monitoring and activity with regard to that school's performance. And specifically would require more rigorous state-determined action, as well as additional monitoring. Now, I mentioned with regard to the 95% test participation rate that ESSA, the statute, leaves it to state discretion how to weight and to factor 95% participation rate into accountability systems. The Notice of Proposed Rulemaking takes a much more aggressive stance on 95% participation rate. It would require that if any school misses the 95% participation rate for all students or for any subgroup of students, that the state would have to take some sort of action with regard to that school. And there are a number of options identified. So a state would have to take at least one of the following. It would have to lower the summative performance rating of the school. And so again, there have to be at least 3 summative performance ratings available for schools. And any school that misses 95% would have to have its summative rating adjusted downward. Another option for the state to consider is to assign the lowest performance level on the academic achievement indicator to any school that misses 95% participation. A state might also identify that school for implementation of a targeted support and improvement plan. So as I said, one way to be identified for targeted improvement is to miss 95% under the proposed regulation. And then there's a fourth kind of state, discretion, state-designed intervention. So rather than taking one of those 3 defined interventions, a state could take some sort of equally rigorous state-determined action. If a state uses that 4th option, though, then it's required that the district develop, the district hold the school accountable for having a school improvement plan approved and monitored by the LEA. And if the district has a significant number of schools missing 95%, then the district would also have to have an improvement plan approved by the state that would specifically address the 95% participation rate challenge and have strategies for improving that in years to come. This is, I think, without reservation, one of the areas of the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking that is garnering significant pushback from a number of groups. But it's also one that the civil rights advocacy groups have felt strongly about and have urged the department to take a more bold stance here because test participation has been such an issue in a number of states with state opt-out laws. ESSA, as you may well know, has, specifically makes clear that the 95% participation rate does not overrule any state or local authority that would allow parents to opt a student out of tests. So, that's really viewed more as an individual right of parents, and they would still be allowed to do that. But for accountability purposes, then it would have to be factored into accountability in some way. And if this Notice of Proposed Rulemaking is adopted as drafted, at least one of these interventions would have to be taken by the state for any school that misses 95%.
And Amy, this is Kelly. I think it's worth reiterating that this is a key question. There are multiple questions on the current survey that's out for NASP members and principal input on this point and the 95% participation rate and where schools are falling short and what would be an appropriate state determined rigorous action. So more information on that will follow.
And let me add one other, Kelly, that I kind of glossed over back on the slide around differentiation. This area of summative ratings for schools was not specifically required by the law, but the notice of proposed rulemaking does say that accountability needs to result in a summative rating from one of 3 ratings categories. And I was in a discussion last week with some state-level leaders, and one of the comments I heard there was that the department, and I don't know how true this is, but that the department had really struggled with the notion of how would a school be identified in the lowest 5% of Title I schools if the state did not have a summative rating as part of the accountability system. So I think that's an area, too, for you all to consider commenting on, and the feasibility of how one might identify a lowest 5% without some sort of, published summative rating. But I wanted to share some of that thinking that I'd heard around that issue in particular.
Thank you. I think we will certainly hear from principals and talk about whether or not that proposed rule would actually push us back to a system that more reflects No Child Left Behind and possibly negate the whole point of moving to a multi-metric system if it will only result in a single summative performance rating. So thank you for clarifying that.
So one other slide that is, like the weighting definitions, I think the timeline for the identification of schools is particularly subject to confusion. We've done our best to outline here what we think would happen under the notice of proposed rulemaking. And so as a general rule, comprehensive support and improvement is a identification that has to be made for the first time in 2017 and then at least once every 3 years thereafter. Targeted support and improvement really has to happen every year. So every year a state would run its accountability system under the notice of proposed rulemaking, would end up with some sort of summative rating for every school, and then would identify any school that is in this targeted support and improvement category. But it's more complicated because there are multiple ways within each of those 2 categories to be identified. So let me just try to summarize this slide. So in 17-18 and every year thereafter, a state would have to do a targeted school improvement identification. But because consistently underperforming subgroup, the definition requires 2 years of data. Only in 17-18, only the low-performing subgroup would be identified. Beginning in 2018-19, then the targeted identification would include low-performing subgroups and consistently underperforming subgroups. For comprehensive support and improvement, again, there's 3 ways the school can be identified. For 2017-18, or beginning with 2017-18, a state would have to identify the lowest performing 5% of Title I schools and any school that is a low graduation rate school, under 67%. It wouldn't be until 2021, 3 years out, that a state would have to add to that any chronically low performing subgroup, Title I school. Because again, those are the low performing subgroup schools that are identified for the first time in 17-18, but then fail to improve on the state's timeline. If they fail to improve, then in 2021, they would be identified for comprehensive support and improvement. And then should the law stay in effect and all of this continue on moving forward beyond 2021, you know, each of the 5 kind of subcategories of schools would be subject to identification for targeted or comprehensive support and improvement. Kelly, did I make that muddied, or did that help?
No, I think that helps. It's pretty complicated. I was wondering if you could explain what you meant, and I know you're referring to the authorization when you said if it remains in law, and that's one of the big differences between ESSA and NCLB is this law is only authorized for 4 years, which is interesting. So if you have some perspective on that you want to share, but I think it's important to note in this case where it's setting up this new system, but the law is only authorized for 4 years.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I was referring to. You know, that we do have a shorter timeline here, but as we've seen over the past decade, the term of authorization often does not necessarily equate with the lifespan of the law. So even though we've got a 4-year authorization, we could find ourselves with a law that is essentially in effect for the next generation of students.
That's right.
We'll see. My colleague Reg may want to add more on that, and I'm going to turn it to Reg, and he's going to address a few of the issues around school improvement funding and continuous improvement requirements, and then I know, Kelly, you want to make sure we've got time for question and answer.
Terrific. Thank you, Amy. And I will keep us on track so that we have time for Q&A. I do want to mention, though, that one of the most significant changes to Title I that Congress elected to make was to simplify and provide greater flexibility to states and districts with regard to the resources allocated in federal law for supporting the schools identified under the accountability requirements that Amy just described. You may be familiar with No Child Left Behind's School Improvement Grant Program, which was used as a mechanism to provide additional resources to very low-performing schools, and as it was implemented, included a number of prescribed models defined by the U.S. Department of Education. ESSA eliminates the SIG program, and along with it, the required models that were required by U.S. Ed through both implementation of SIG and also the ESSA waiver process. And the new law instead takes a similar but more simplified approach by allowing states to set aside 7% of Title I formula funding at the state level, specifically for supporting the lowest performing schools identified under state accountability systems. Similar to prior law, 95% of that 7% set aside must flow through 2 school districts that have schools that are implementing, comprehensive support and improvement plans or targeted support and improvement plans. So for those districts with CSI and TSI schools, 95% of those resources will continue to flow down to them. And consistent with implementation of the prior statute school improvement provisions, there is a focus on ensuring that those low-performing schools receive at least a minimal amount of additional targeted support, and that it would be sustained over a reasonable period of time to help turn around those schools, although those awards are not to exceed 4 years. So there are elements of the prior school improvement provisions embedded in the new law, but a much simpler approach that relies much more heavily, as Amy has already begun to describe, on interventions that are defined with the school, at the school and district level in partnership with the state. Next slide, please. So states must use their school improvement fund to really play a supporting role to districts and schools that are identified under the law's accountability requirements. And under the NPRM, that includes an obligation, part of the SEA, to periodically review funding allocations between LEAs and schools, really with a special attention and focus on trying to identify and address the inequities that are identified in the school improvement plans that are developed at the local level. It's incumbent upon the state to use these resources and other ESSA resources to provide technical assistance to the districts that are working in partnership with their low-performing schools to put them on a track towards improved outcomes for all kids, including all of their subgroups. And then at the discretion of the state, they've got to take any additional action that may be needed for those schools that are not satisfying the state's established exit criteria that Amy mentioned. So what we see is a much certainly a much less defined federal role in prescribing the types of interventions that are required for these schools, but also for a sort of clearly defined role for states to be a supporting agent in delivering and executing the plans that are developed at the state and local level. And I think state education agencies will be best positioned to support their district and school level partners if they are thinking comprehensively about not only the Title I set-aside resources for promoting school improvement, but also being very proactive and creative about using other authorized ESSA resources to blend and braid an approach that really is able to kind of maximize the impact and supports that are available for the lowest performing schools under the new accountability systems. You can just back up one slide, please, Amy, to the report cards section. So the new law also places a very strong emphasis on promoting transparency for families and communities about the performance of schools. This is a system that was embedded deeply in No Child Left Behind and in some ways magnified under the Every Student Succeeds Act with an eye towards trying to create transparency that leads to strong community involvement and support for the lowest performing schools in the state. Each authorized public chartering agency in the state, for example, has to report the percentage of students in each subgroup in each charter school compared to percentages in the broader LEA or community from which the charter draws a significant portion of its students. Major focus, of course, on the academic achievement of those schools, and then kind of clear direction about how student achievement data has to be presented, including a focus on later post-secondary enrollment data by high school, or if that data is not collected, when it will be reported if a system is not presently in place. Next slide. So before we turn to Q&A, the last thing I want to mention is that states will be working between now and next spring to file the plans that will describe their accountability systems and other Title I requirements this period of, and part of the implementation process is, of course, critically important. Thankfully, the law is also very clear that SEAs are to be proactive about engaging with school leaders and other stakeholders in the development of these plans so that they are developed with the input from every part of the system that should be informing the approach that the state ultimately takes. So we hope that you'll use this information today and continued resources provided by NAESP to make yourself part of that process through your district leadership, through direct contact with your SEA. Those plans based on the NPRM will most likely be due for submission to USED either by March of next year or July. They are planning to provide 2 submission deadlines to provide some flexibility to states. It may seem 12 months out that is a ways off, but that period is going to go by very quickly, and some states may elect to work on and complete their plans earlier in 2017, given that these systems have to be implemented by the 17-18 school year. So please, don't hesitate if you're willing to be a strong principal voice in the development of these plans in your states. So we'll stop there. Thank you again for your time, and we would love to open the floor to questions.
Okay, thanks, Amy and Reg. Lots of information to digest there. I know there are a couple of questions that folks have written in about, and one of the things that is most notable that both of you covered very well was articulating how the system in school improvement has shifted so that states and now LEAs who will have a more prominent role in supporting schools to really think about building the capacity of educators, which obviously under the SIG model that wasn't necessarily the case. But we have a question that a principal, actually our president, Robin Hansen of NASP, was wondering, who's a great leader in the community and out there really talking with principals about the new law, and she was curious about if you've talked, as you've been in conversations with states, and they're looking at the new provisions, and particularly that related to a needs assessment once a school has been identified in comprehensive or targeted support. Are there good templates for a quality needs assessment? Because we know that's really going to be where the rubber hits the road. If what that school needs and what that principal needs to help move that school to the next level is not included in that needs assessment, it's not necessarily getting off on the right foot. So I know there's probably going to be a lot more work and discussion on that point to come, but wondered if in your conversation with states, if this has come up, or even with districts.
Yeah, Kelly, this is Amy, and I wish I could think of some states off the top of my head, but I think the short answer is yes, and we can help you identify a few of those if that's helpful. Because states that were kind of early waiver states and were, shifting from AYP to really having to just identify priority and focus schools. I know I talked to several of them, a couple of years ago that were working on needs assessments specifically for focus schools that would now essentially be the targeted support. But they may be applicable to all schools, but really then trying to understand where you've got concentrated issues of performance, what kind of tools or templates or rubrics might be best for doing a needs assessment. So I think we can help you find a few of those. It's not completely new territory for some states. I will note, though, that the needs assessment, again, for at least the comprehensive schools has to address resource inequities, and that's an area that I think states and districts have done less on historically. And that's not just kind of funding inequities. It's also meant to include a look at human capital and particular teacher effectiveness and experience and issues of educator disproportionality in terms of assignment. Low inexperienced or more inexperienced teachers to schools of low income, disproportionate rates.
And I think you know, as a national association, we wholly supported that that dashboard approach to looking at what's being allocated to schools, and it had offered and advocated that access to professional learning for not just teachers, but also opportunities for principals that were available as part of that resource equity and determination or resource allocation. Reg, did you have anything to add on the needs assessment?
I would only add quickly that in addition to the needs assessment obligation for low-performing schools in Title I, we see that model in some other elements of ESSA as well, and I would call your attention in particular to the new Title IV block grant, the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grant Program, which would provide relatively flexible funding at both the state and district level, focused on everything from student enrichment opportunities to school safety and conditions for learning to technology. That new program is grounded in a needs assessment model as well. So I think developing a comprehensive needs assessment system is vitally important, and being thoughtful about the types of questions you would use to guide that process is a critical first step, because you ultimately aren't able to identify needs you don't ask about. And I know that seems simple, but I think going through a deliberative process with your teachers, with your peers, to make sure that whatever that assessment ultimately becomes is comprehensive in nature is really important.
I think that's a great point. Underscores the need to not just focus on one particular area of opportunity ESSA affords, but across the provisions from Title I through Title IV. We have a question about the state methodology that will be used to determine the quantitative value of low performing. So the example provided is that students scoring below 70% in a particular subgroup on a state assessment would be considered low performing. And I think Amy and Reg, and you can add to this, but really that is going to be a state determined value. And I think this also relates to the determination of weighting and substantial, and you know, that the discussion of a lot of the terms within the accountability system that were somewhat vague and left open-ended in the actual statute, but in the proposed rule, kind of, there's still, I would argue, the department is offering a few more contours or parameters around those terms.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, this is an area where it really is left to states to determine what is low performing and that methodology. And just as you said, right, how they weight then the different indicators, you know, putting more emphasis on growth or kind of prioritizing to the extent that they can those school quality and academic success indicators. So, yeah, that's really going to come down to how states decide to design their systems in a lot of ways.
Okay, and one last question relates to implications for evaluation. And I think the issue of evaluation is interesting to note that ESSA for those states that have waivers for No Child Left Behind, the waivers in exchange for some regulatory flexibility on some No Child Left Behind provisions. One of the conditions of the waiver is that states and districts employ teacher and principal evaluation systems, and ESSA effectively rolls back that requirement and now allows states to continue and districts using teacher and principal evaluation, but it's not required under federal law. There are opportunities to address teacher and principal evaluation systems and adjust them according to the new accountability systems that will be put in place, and more specifically using Title II dollars. But really that's an issue that we could see forthcoming once these states have their new systems in place. So Reg and Amy, I open up comments on that question for you.
Reg, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right, Kelly. We will see on August 1st the official end of the obligations that were required of states that adopted the waiver framework, including mandatory evaluation systems. The Congress elected to permit states and districts to use their Title II resources under the new law to support those systems, to continue them, to improve them if they wish. But it is optional under the new approach.
Great, thanks. So it looks like we're at the top of the hour now. I wanted to circle back to if we could advance the slide, there should be one or two more with some contact information. Okay, so again, thank you everyone for attending this important webinar on accountability and the ESSA provisions. I know this is not the first conversation or the first presentation that we'll be having. We wanted to make sure that we have, again, the nuts and bolts on the accountability provisions available to you, and provided a nice deep dive today, so thank you, Reg and Amy. And for principals and others who are out there, what's next? What do you do with this? Well, many of you may be involved in your state's planning process. Many states have public notice, public meeting, work groups, but really NASP has seen quite literally everyone's all over the map on how this planning process is moving forward. And one of the most important provisions in ESSA requires states and districts, as they're putting these new plans together with regard to accountability and other programmatic areas across ESSA from Title I through Title IV, but right now specifically on Title I, states and districts are required to engage principals as a key stakeholder in the process. So if you are not involved in those discussions, we encourage you to use and flex your ESSA knowledge muscle. And what that means is really understanding the law's provisions and taking important discussions based on issues and areas or challenges of practice that you've identified that you know ESSA is an opportunity to address, and taking that to your district and to your state leaders. And then finally, on the next slide, we have some resources. NAESP will be uploading this webinar presentation on its ESSA page. We've also highlighted where you can go to see official Department of Education regulation and notices. A lot of the important information on that page we've cross-posted and curated for you on the NAESP page, so you don't have to go hunting around. But most importantly, I mentioned that we do have a survey out to all NAESP members regarding the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, and collecting input and comments that we will be using from principals directly to inform official comments that we will be filing with the U.S. Department of Education that will discuss a lot of the proposed rules and issues that Reg and Amy outlined for you today. So if you are interested and do not have a copy of the survey, and if you are interested in completing it and providing some feedback, please feel free to email me and we can talk you through that. So thank you everyone. We appreciate your time. Reg and Amy, again, thank you. for joining us, and we look forward to hosting you, I hope, in the future. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Our pleasure. Thanks, Kelly, and thanks, everybody.